Today we're going to be discussing IP theft. So modern businesses are always, creating assets online. These are intangible assets, and most of the time, they do it without even realizing it. Now, it's very important to protect these rights. They have a lot of value to businesses, especially now with the digital age. And, it's really important to have measures in place which protect these rights online. So ultimately, businesses need to be aware of the IP that they're creating and how they can protect it, and what, on the flip side, what the risk of actually committing IP theft are. There's two sides to the coin. Obviously, you need to protect your own rights, but then you need to also ensure you're not encroaching on others' rights as well. So earlier we touched on the fact that you need to put measures in place to protect your IP. To be able to actually do that, firstly you need to understand what IP assets you currently hold. So we always advise to do a preliminary IP audit. And what this will do is essentially, you imagine you've got a warehouse and you've been creating all these intangible assets, and usually these comes from ideas that you've been implementing in your business. So that could be a brand name that you've been building up, and you've built substantial goodwill in it with your consumers. So ultimately what we want to do is really map out the assets that you've been building up, and then that will allow us to come to the next step, which is about how we can monetize that and understand the value you've been creating with those intangible assets. Okay, so once you've mapped out your IP assets, this is when we then start thinking about the value of those assets. So it might be some designs that have been helping you make some products. It could be your brand names, so we'd start thinking about the value they've been providing. Maybe through your website, that brand name drives a lot of clicks to your website, for example. It could be a novel process which is maybe patentable. And so when we're thinking about the value and what the potential registrability of these rights are, we can then start to really focus on what gives you that, on what is monetizable, essentially. And one way to think about it, in terms of the importance of analysing and valuing these assets, is imagining, if they got into the hands of your competitor, for example, the time and effort it will take you to build up those assets again. So, by doing this valuation process, you then, you can really understand the commercial value it's giving to you, and it will give you that added, motivation to actually get these registered. Okay, so auditing and valuing your IP assets, that's obviously very important. Now, it then comes to how you can best put yourself in a position where your IP assets are protected and they can't be, stolen by third-party infringers. Now, there's two methods going about this. There's the internal method, making sure in-house that firstly your employees understand the nature of the work that they're dealing with. Maybe you deal with a lot of copyrightable works, and therefore you need to ensure that they understand the works they're dealing with, obviously keeping it confidential, ensuring that your employees have signed NDAs, those non-disclosure agreements. And then you've got the external methods, registering your rights with the correct offices. So, you've got your trademarks, you've got your patents, you've got your design rights. Now, when you've got this assembly of rights set up externally and internally, then you can be sure that, you've got that fortress of IP assets that you've now protected, and that will ensure that they're not stolen going forward. So once we have this, fortress of IP assets that we're now protecting, all these rights are registered, internally everyone understands that your company, how to best go about using these assets. We then need to ensure that we're proactively monitoring for any potential infringements of those registered rights. Now, there's multiple tools that are out there for, different kinds of rights. So let's say, you've got a trademark, because of a brand that you've really built up over time. We've then got these specialized softwares that allow us to scan the internet and monitor to detect any potential infringements. And that allows us to really quickly enforce against those as well. So ultimately, it's very important to be very proactive when it comes to enforcement. And that ensures there's no repeat infringements as well. Because once you start letting it go, all of a sudden your brand's being used by all these different entities, and it's difficult to keep track of, and then the problem really builds up. So proactive enforcement is definitely the way to go. Okay, so nowadays in the digital age, companies invest a lot of money into, building their presence online, building their brand online. And to do this, companies are utilising social media channels, domain names, e-commerce platforms. So you've almost got this network of different modes that companies are now using to get their brand out there. Now, on the flip side, when you think about IP theft online and how your online assets can be stolen, how your IP rights can be infringed upon, it is that same process. Those infringers, it's almost like a network and they're a business themselves. They target your domain names, they target your social media profiles, your e-commerce platforms. So when it comes to domain names, that could mean cyber squatting on a similar domain name, or typo squatting, so misspelling the domain name to misdirect other consumers in that space to that website instead. And to do this, they can then carry out phishing, for example, or try and defraud your consumers. So that's the domain side. On social media accounts, they can try and impersonate your usernames, and that then connects to the domain names as well. So you've got those two modes that are now connecting. And then you've also got your e-commerce platforms, those online marketplaces, your Amazons, your eBays, your Etsy's. Once they use that and they've got that tripod of those three different modes, they can then really start to make an impact on your brand in a very negative way, because they can really use your IP assets and scale it up online, which obviously they couldn't do in the past. So your enforcement approach really needs to mirror that and ensure you're proactively monitoring those three modes across the internet. So, despite the fact that you can create this fortress of IP rights through registering them, there is obviously the distinct possibility that they can still be infringed upon. So let's say you've got a patent for a novel process you had, let's say in the construction industry, for example, and then you notice a competitor using the same process, that you've got patented in one of their tools and mechanisms. Now, what you need to do is go into detective mode. You need to track and evidence the infringements that you've seen. And to do that, you shouldn't be contacting the other side and the suspected infringers. You should really be creating that trail of infringement. Give all the evidence. Mirror up the dates and when it happened. Ensure that you're clear on what the infringement is. And then at that stage, you should contact IP solicitors, who can then obviously advise you further. So earlier on, we were discussing, how you can prevent the theft of your IP. And part of that discussion involved the internal dynamic where you ensure that employees understand the confidential nature of the IP rights that you're using. You ensure that you have those contracts in place with any parties you're engaging with, those NDAs. And on the flip side, you have to ensure that you're not infringing on other parties' IP assets at the same time. And it's almost a similar process. You have to ensure that your employees are trained. If they're sourcing materials from another company that you're not engaged with, ensure that you've contacted them. You've actually got a license, for example. If you're a streaming service like Netflix, they really make sure that they're sourcing, the owner of a copyright, for example, if they're using a photograph, for a poster of one of their films. So you really just have to ensure you have that audit trail and understand who's the owner of a copyright work, for example. So in terms of avoiding IP theft, if you do think that you have potentially infringed on someone else's registered IP rights, or if you have received a claim from solicitors regarding the theft of IP rights, then you really should just contact solicitors, IP specialist solicitors, and they'll very quickly be able to measure up the veracity of the claim and whether or not it actually has legs or not. Because a lot of the time you might receive pre-action correspondence, but actually there's no real substance to it. So definitely contact IP specialists, and then they'll take it from there.
To you, it'd be more, normal.
Is it rolling?
Yeah.
Yeah, just take it.
Such a bastard.
Save that for the B-roll.
Sure.